Hello and welcome to the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm Patrick McNicholas, the artist and researcher behind Time Travel Tulsa, and as always, I'm joined with local historian and friend John Beasley. In this show, we discuss Tulsa's past, present, and future, so sit back and relax as we talk Tulsa Times. So thanks for joining us for the premiere episode of the Tulsa Times podcast. I want to give a quick background on who we are and exactly why this podcast started. First of all, I'm Patrick, and as most of you know, I operate the Time Travel Tulsa page, and I want to introduce my co-host, who's also a tour guide downtown, former teacher as well, and fellow history buff just like me, John Riverview Beasley. So go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Patrick. So my family moved here to the Tulsa area in 1978. So I was 8 years old. So I have, seen a lot of change in Tulsa, from the Main Street Mall, ice skating at Williams Center Forum, of course, bells and Casa Bonita, which are always popular topics.
And we're going to go over all of those eventually. Not tonight, but definitely sometime soon.
So I remember Sammy Sosa and Pudge Rodriguez. I remember when Woodland Hills Mall opened. So, a lot of change in the time that I've been here. And so more recently, I've been a tour guide and researcher for Tulsa Foundation for Architecture. I've been doing that since 2016. And for a few years now, I've also been a tour guide for Tours of Tulsa. So I hope to provide maybe some color commentary, if you will, along the way. And I will certainly state my opinion. For example, best movie ever filmed in Tulsa, UHF, hands down, full stop, no question, argue. UHF, Weird Al, 1989. Yeah,
and we're hoping to have him back. He spent some time up in RSU in Claremore, and I know personally people that got a chance to meet him when he came back for that. But, originally we kind of met, before we worked as tour guides for the Outsiders House, but we did that for 7 months on the weekends until the coronavirus eventually showed up. But yeah, we drove that big bus. So if you've been over at the Outsiders House, that big bus in the back, we had a TV and my images played up on it. And we went to 12 different locations. So maybe even some of you guys that are listening to this were a part of those fun times that we had on the weekends, because honestly, we had, 60 people a week and from all over the place. I mean, it would not be unusual to have people from 3 different states on, and we'd pick them up at the Hyatt and go down to the Circle for the first spot. But we're working again together, and we started this podcast as an addition to kind of our history interests and projects that we both have going. And you obviously have a YouTube channel.
Sure. It's a lot of fun for me to kind of share, Tulsa through my eyes. So yeah, I've got several episodes up. I was hoping to, because I have the day tomorrow, but I think we're supposed to start at 12 degrees or so tomorrow morning. So I'm going to put that episode off until sometime next week. But you mentioned my YouTube channel. You have a YouTube channel of your own, and then you have some other experience with radio or digital podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, back at Oklahoma State, I did some internet radio with a station that doesn't exist anymore, but KXZY internet radio. And, we did DJ music mainly, but we also talked. It was me and the roommate of mine, so they really just let us kind of have the place, and that's maybe why it doesn't exist anymore. But no, we had a good time, and the show that I have is called The Color Volume, so that was where I got kind of my first interest in online, or I guess kind of digital audio. But I've been featured as a guest on other podcasts, and I've always kind of been jealous that I haven't been able to kind of get one going myself. So Future episodes, we're going to be having guests on that'll bring greater insight and, the latest information about what's happening in town, because there's a lot of development happening, and I couldn't tell you everything about that because it changes so often, a daily basis even. But the main goal of this podcast really is to educate and inform, and like I said, act as a historical record of its own. So the idea is really an extension to the Time Travel Tulsa page for people that have seen that. I'm limited to how much I can tell on a lot of those pages. So, for instance, on Instagram, I'm limited to about 375 words. And when telling stories on there's a lot of things that get left out. And so, for instance, the most recent post, the Los Angeles, the blimp, you've seen the photo, and of course it's featured in a lot of books, and there's also a lot of talk about the future of that travel even happening in downtown with the 320 Boston building.
Yeah, that's going to be featured because there is a picture of the Los Angeles, and you can kind of see it between the Phil Tower and the National Bank of Tulsa building, and that picture is on display, and we'll come across it during next month's tunnel tour with Tulsa Foundation for Architecture. So every second Saturday, I lead a tour, a walking tour for Tulsa Foundation for Architecture, so be sure to check them out. Follow us on social media. But excited about February is the tunnel tours, and we will be both in that Phil Tower and in 320 and 320 South Boston, which is the old National Bank of Tulsa building. Those are the two buildings featured in that picture. And it's kind of interesting because we do have one tour guide that still kind of presents it as factual, that 320, the National Bank of Tulsa building, was going to be a mooring station for these airships. There's also a 2014 book about Tulsa that presents that as factual information as well. Now, you and I have both seen things that, really make that impossible. The Los Angeles could not dock in downtown Tulsa, but it's those myths or urban legends that they're fun stories, and that's how they keep getting told over and over. And it's almost like, I hate to disappoint y'all, but the facts are...
Yeah, and we all want to believe that a blimp somehow landed on top of a building downtown. And, we can't say that it didn't exactly, because obviously the Los Angeles, it being the size that it was, there's no way that safely it could have got in between, But, with the airport in our air history, aviation history, which is an upcoming episode, there is a possibility that maybe some of the smaller planes could have been moored somewhere downtown. However, the 320 Boston building doesn't look like, if you were to get someone, a passenger off the airship, you'd actually have to go through the top of that building, and there's really just a steam vent. So it looks as though could have been possible, but it also looks a lot like other buildings at the time that were mooring stations. So I can understand, the confusion. And that amazing iconic photo is really one that's going to be used over and over. I was really glad to be able to work with Damon's Dronography to shoot that last week or a few weeks ago and get that out there for people to see. And a lot of people liked it. So we're hoping to use that again in the future and also work again in the future. But who I work for is Tulsa People, and I do a monthly article for them about just Tulsa history. It's the last page of the entire magazine, so pretty easy to find for those looking for it. But the Robinson Hotel is featured on there this month and will be on my page later this month. The last one I did was street markers, and again, that's a huge, long topic. And
it is. It's amazing. The street names. We should get callers for that podcast to argue about Xanthus, Exanthus, and Exanthus.
Well, yeah, and one of the things about the street things, and one thing that we were talking about, Cherry Street, there's not a whole lot of solid evidence, but one thing that I did notice when I was researching telephones, they had the telephone like sequence would be Cherry, you talk to the operator. So I think it kind of got more of a strength from the fact that it was a telephone area, so that's kind of an interesting thing to. But obviously, it's a new year. We're going to take a look back at 2021 coming up. But this week as well, what birthday was it? 100?
It was 124 years of Tulsa. So, yeah, it was back in 1898 that Tulsa officially became a city. Now, Tulsa was, pretty insignificant. The railroad line, of course, came through in 1882. But by 1900, which was our first official census, there were less than 1,400 people in town. So, we were just a sleepy little railroad cattle town, really, was our main focus. We were still largely agriculture. It wasn't until then 1905 and the discovery of oil in the Red Fork that, Tulsa became what it is. In that 10 years between 1900 and 1910, after the discovery of oil, our population went from 1,400 to over 18,000. And then by 1920, we were at like 75,000. So just, seriously exponential growth once oil was discovered and we became the oil capital of the world.
And there's a lot to add to that story, of course. And again, we're going to save that for another upcoming episode. So we got plenty to talk about. But again, this is the latest developments that are happening now. And the Discovery Center opening next week.
There you go. Yeah, like a new birthday.
Yeah.
So it's Monday. Monday is opening day for the new Children's Discovery Lab there at 31st and Riverside Drive, right there on the grounds of Gathering Place.
And they claim 75,000 plants, trees, and new shrubs. And I was like thinking of that place a few years ago when it was just a huge parking lot. So there's a lot of work that just got put in on that alone. The building itself, they said 250 people, or, kind of like a theater type thing. And a lot of things that reminisce its old location at Owen Park.
Yeah, excellent. Yes. Looking forward to seeing it. Huge fan, being a grandparent. I've been in the old one there at Owen Park with grandkids and looking forward to making new memories with the grandkids at this new Children's Discovery Lab.
And you were just over in the new area with the pedestrian bridge. You were taking some photos there, some panoramas of what's happening.
I've uploaded a picture today.
Both the past and the present are existing.
Exactly, yeah. Right here the present.
They don't need me.
The past and the future. We've still got, there's just a little section of that 1915 Midland Valley Railroad Bridge that was the pedestrian bridge since the mid-'70s. And then on the west side, the new pedestrian bridge continues to move across the river. So it is kind of a unique time where we can, in the present, see both Tulsa's past and Tulsa's future.
I know, and it's I'm looking forward to the pedestrian bridge. And over on Riverside as well, we have the neon lights that are back up and running. Route 66 Neon Park, I believe it's called. And, unfortunately, there was some damage to the lights that left them dark for a while. But again, they're back on, and I plan on getting up there soon to do a time lapse. But again, with this weather and the wind and hopefully we don't have a February like last year.
No. Yes, yeah. It's one of those things that we will always remember from 2021. And there were many, but I think it was the most consecutive hours under 32 degrees was the record that we had. I just know it was horrible. I remember, after weeks when the heater finally shut off for the first time and it was like quiet. So it was a little odd because, again, that heater had been going constantly for, a couple weeks?
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in the yearly recap. But we're also awaiting the USA BMX over in the Greenwood area to open, which I think is going to be coming up within the next few months. And also OK Pop, which I haven't been lucky enough to take a tour yet, but we've seen plenty of photos from outside and inside as well. The church studio, we did get a tour to take of last week.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah, because I got to lead a group on a tour through, and just amazing. I am a huge fan of Teresa Knox and all that she's done for Tulsa. You know, she started really with the vocational schools was her passion, and then that since Harweldon was her first major project. And again, I was there last week or so, and I just love everything she's done. Really spared no expense, you know, and I think you and I saw that in the church studio. It is a serious studio. And, you know, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but Kenny Loggins has already recorded in that space. Michael McDonald is scheduled to come in. Jackson Brown is scheduled to come in. You know, it is going to be a working studio, as well as, you know, the event center, the museum, the archives, everything else that Teresa has added.
Well, there's been, and a lot of people don't even know, because there was not a lot of photographic evidence at the time, but you know, Willie Nelson was there. Tom Petty signed his first contract across the street.
Right, and what's now the Freeway Cafe.
Correct, and so I mean, you know, that alone, I think there could even be like a book or something. But we were lucky enough again to take that tour. It's finishing, its renovations. But yeah, it looks amazing in there. I mean, I don't think it's unmatched. And I've been in a handful of studios, and one of them that is very deceptive from the outside, but when you get in there, it's like, how is this much space in here? But it's David Teagarden's studio, which is just down the road. So we may have our studio row here, our own studio row here in Tulsa. So who knows with that?
So many exciting things in Tulsa. It's really, you know.
Well, music alone. I mean, you know, Bob Dylan,
true.
like we said,
yes,
and OK
Dylan
Pop. I mean,
archives.
it just seems like it's kind of all connecting, and we're seeing a lot more house shows. I mean, there's music every night somewhere. But one of the last updates is something that's going to be coming up, an exhibit of mine with Art House and the Lost in America Gallery called Technology and Art. And it's going to be, again, at the Lost in America Gallery, 21st Memorial, from February 5th through the 20th. And I'm going to have 2 lenticular prints on that, and some more exhibits on the way. So that's what's coming up. But what do you remember from this past year? We're going to jump into our yearly recap and go over some of the memorable moments from this past year. Of course, it's impossible to mention everything, but certainly some things stood out. Fourth coldest February on record. There were hundreds of waterline breaks just in my neighborhood alone, and like you were saying, 11 days below 32 degrees. And negative 13-degree night, which matched the lowest of that of 1918.
Yeah, it's not a record that I enjoy setting, that's for sure.
And it's going to be cold this week, and we're not even to February just yet, but as of the recording of this. But this time last year we had Sundance, and this time this year we have Sundance, just not in Tulsa. Last year it was one of 20 satellite sites. The Admiral Twin, someplace you probably don't want to be in this cold temperature, but it was used last year and is one of 400 drive-ins left in America. And of course, we've probably all been there, or at least seen it in The Outsiders in a few different locations. But some historic investment in Tulsa this past year, $800 million in downtown alone. And, you know, still no love to the Bank of Commerce.
Right. You and I have been watching that building for a while. You know, it sold a couple of years ago, and it's for sale again. But yes, one of these days we will get to see under those, ugly black metal panels that cover those beautiful limestone columns that are on that National Bank of Commerce building on 3rd Street. But yeah, all the development, you talked about $800 million, you know, the fact that all year you could look out onto the Tulsa skyline and there were 3, 4, 5 cranes up in the air between Davenport Lofts, the new WPX building, the new Santa Fe Square development behind Hotel Indigo, which is, still relatively new. So, yeah, it is, again, exciting time to be in Tulsa.
There's definitely a lot of love going to new developments, but I would still say, we still need some love on the, like I was saying, the Bank of Commerce and the Parker Drilling Building, everything that got quote unquote modernized. It would be great to see that unmodern. I mean, it would have been great in that conversation. Like this was a good idea, it would have been
right.
Just to be a fly on the wall.
A different time and place. It was, the 1960s, 1970s. They wanted everything to look new and modern. And so that McBurney building had a beautiful Art Deco facade on the bottom level. And then they literally chopped the top off. The spires that were atop that building were cut off. And those black metal panels installed because somebody thought it looked cool and modern and space age.
And that's right across the street from where the Robinson Hotel was, which I mentioned is that Tulsa People article currently. But also from this past year and the year before that, we had 2 presidential visits just in 2 years, and the first president to visit Greenwood. And of course, Tulsa was the center of attention last year for the mass graves and the centennial. And just right before that, one of the 15 documentaries that premiered on network TV, I was lucky enough to work on the Westbrook produced documentary, Terror in Tulsa. And I was interviewed for it, and I became pretty good friends with the director, but unfortunately I wasn't in the final cut, which was only an hour long or so. But it was crazy how Tulsa became kind of the center of attention for, again, 15 documentaries, multiple podcasts that was just on that topic alone, like multiple episodes.
When you talk about Tulsa in 2021, I mean, that is singularly the biggest event, that recognition of the centennial of the massacre of 1921 and the destruction of Greenwood.
And one of the things that, that this podcast has that those podcasts don't is, personal experiences from Tulsans that night. And for me, that candlelight visual with the light rain and them singing spirituals, hallelujah. Reverend Turner was there. There was a guy with a huge, I was just looking at the video earlier today, and there were people with cameras everywhere. I mean, lucky enough, I had my, I was more kind of, commemorating the event, so I didn't have my camera with me. I just had a few photos from my phone. But, I mean, the feeling in the air, I don't know if you were there that night, but the feeling in the air that night was, it really was emotional. And the fact that I spent, a lot of my time last year researching this topic, and, there was an amazing response to my work, which was featured on my favorite photography website, Petapixel, and of course, focusing on that history for most of the year for me really took an emotional toll, and it's still, there's still a lot of unanswered questions to the whole thing.
There are, and we could do an episode or two about not only that event, but then the 100 years subsequent and how we dealt with it. But I really appreciate your role. I know you had a few different exhibits, not only locally and at Greenwood, but you even had an exhibit out of state during that time, right?
Yeah, and there was the 2021, which was actually in Greenwood, alongside the Black Wall Street Alliance, and those guys had an even better exhibit downstairs, which just had every square inch of the wall was covered.
Extensive. You could spend hours.
Yeah, and that was open. I mean, you could go in there, but Lincoln spent so much time, and big shout out to Shane and Lincoln at the Black Wall Street Alliance, who had the old Williams building, or the location of the Williams building on the corner. They had an old 1920s vehicle that was donated. I mean, if you were in Greenwood for the events, you really kind of witnessed something that was very unique. And then, of course, other places in town. I had exhibit with Phil Brook, Limitations and Now, and Quraish Ali Lanzana, who was my teacher for the first Tulsa Race Massacre class. And then the Centennial Project of Living Arts, which opened the same night as the Liggett Gallery. But also, you mentioned, out of town, the Calaboose African American Museum in San Marcos, and working with the Historical Society again this past year. But the biggest impact was that exhibit, working with Don Thompson, recreating his photos that he took. A lot of times I don't actually get to connect with the photographer that took the photos. So actually working with him and hearing his stories, behind it. He was a teacher at Booker T. Washington, photographed North Tulsa for 40 years plus, and has his work even featured in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian African American Museum. And he has a book that he gave me as well. But we did this great image of the Williams family, and prior to that, a lot of people knew about the Dreamland Theater. Over 700 people could fit in there, and it was kind of it played a role in the beginning of that night 100 years ago. But the image that we did was the whole 3 generations of the family. So on the left side, we had the famous image of the car and their son in the back seat. So 2 generations. The Dreamland, where it was originally placed, which I have that photo on my page, and then Don's photo of Lloyd Williams, who was outside of the pharmacy. And again, that was 3 generations of the Williams family. But Don Thompson, great person for Tulsa, and still doing photography. And I hope to talk with him again. He had his images used for the Pathway of Hope, which opened right before the Centennial. And then after the Centennial, or right at the Centennial, Greenwood Rising opened.
Yeah, and so that Pathway to Hope, for people that aren't familiar with, that's the connecting route from, what's known as Deep Greenwood there at Greenwood and Archer, and it goes around past, or aside Highway 412, 244, and that connects Greenwood to the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park. So between the ball field and the highway is that Pathway to Hope. And I encourage everybody to get out there, check it out. You mentioned Greenwood Rising. They have a great app that you can see those pictures that you talked about of the Williams family, of the Dreamland Theater. And so there are stops throughout, that small portion that's left of Greenwood after, not only the massacre, but then, urban renewal, the highway, Oklahoma State University, everything that has impacted that. But they have many of those photos on that app, so you can stand in those places where those significant buildings once were.
And that path also takes you to the museum around the corner in the Maybelle B. Little House, and that's where the president
Cultural
stopped earlier in the year. But we had a museum open, but we also had one closed. And
we did, yes, Gilchrist, after 60 years almost.
But it's temporary.
It is, yeah. So it was. I know it was a tough decision for those decision makers, but the building, again, from the 1960s, it was difficult to keep up with, to modernize that building. And museums of today are nothing like they were 50, 60, 75 years ago.
The advance of technology, the use of technology in all these museums, including Greenwood Rise. I mean, it's
indeed. Yes, fantastic. Yeah, so it was just easier, cheaper, just the better option to just knock down the current building. So that new building, the new Gilchrist, is going to be on that same site. And, so with the changes, you had mentioned the pedestrian bridge, that Midland Valley Railroad bridge earlier, with the demolition of Greenwood. It was very difficult for some people. And, I have the same experiences. I was at Gilchrist when I was a kid. I took my children July 3rd, the day, that weekend that Gilchrist was closed. I took my two oldest grandsons. We have great memories there, but I'm also very excited to make those new memories with my grandkids. The first time I was at Gilchrist was when my grandparents took me. So now with the new Gilchrist, I have the opportunity to take my grandchildren and introduce them to the new Gilchrist.
Well, a lot of people were carrying Gilchrist around with them, and they didn't even know it for years. It was on the license plate for Oklahoma, and that was the Sacred Rain Arrow statue that's famously at Gilchrist and has been there since the late 80s. But yeah, the license plate, I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the arrow towards the sky, and we were connected with Gilchrist and didn't even know it, or a lot of people were.
Throughout the state, yeah. Everybody had it on the back of their car.
But we look forward to it reopening when it does. So other things from this past year, of course, sports highlights. We had, the Ironman...
Yeah, so Iron Man was on Riverside Drive. It was all over Northeast Oklahoma. Between
and Greenwood,
the swimming, the biking, and running. Most of that running did take place on Riverside Drive, as you mentioned earlier. I'm Riverview, so love that neighborhood. That's the focus of most of my YouTube videos as well, are things in and around Riverview. But yeah, the Ironman was exciting. It was a great day for Tulsa. It was a great day on the river. We had the return of Tulsa Tough, always huge for downtown, but specifically, you and I got to hang out at my apartment on the river for Crybaby Hill.
I always take as many photos as I can so I can remember it.
There you go. Yes. Yeah.
No, we always have too much fun, and that's usually kind of the MO when you're down there is if you're not having fun, then you're in the wrong spot.
Right. You're not doing it right.
Yeah. But, just sports in general, Oklahoma is known as a sports haven for many athletes. And some great soccer matches that were this past year. Indeed. Tulsa Athletics,
yes,
who I became kind of a bandwagon fan of. They used to be the Roughnecks, of course, not FC Tulsa. These are two different teams, but they reached the NPLS National Championship game, and I was unfortunately unable to see that, but I was able to see it live on TV. But we attended every other game, and a lot of those same team players play for Tulsa Soccer, which won their conference and reached the Elite Eight in that kind of sort of March Madness, I guess you could call it, a bracket for the NCAA. But speaking of March Madness, it was ORU who made it to the Elite Eight, unfortunately lost, but they were a 15 seed making it to the Elite Eight. Max A-Smith, they lost by 2 points to a 3 seed Arkansas.
Amazing. Yes, unbelievable. There was a lot of excitement for sure in this town about that.
I mean, March Madness is always fun, but when you have somebody in the fight, that makes it all that much better. Because most of the time we have our teams get knocked out so early and we expect them to go much longer.
Yep.
But
think about you, O-State. Disappointed a few times.
And, of course, we had a Bedlam win if you're an OK State fan like myself. But breaking news this past year, we need a breaking news sound. Drillers turned noodlers.
Noodlers.
A lime green design.
That was interesting.
They were doing noodling. Noodling
no G.
tutorials live at the game.
It was interesting.
And
it's definitely Oklahoma.
I wish I would have screenshotted some of those comments that they got because it was a promotional thing more than it was probably anything for them.
Oh, yeah. They sold a lot of merchandise that week, let me tell you.
And it's probably being resold for even more now. But
so have you noodled? Have
No,
you ever
of
been in the
course
river?
not. I mean, I grew up.
I have.
They call him John Riverside Beasley, but they call me Patrick Okie from Muskogee McNicholas. So that's where I was born, grew up on Lake Eufaula, and there was noodling happening very frequently.
Yes, the Okie Noodling Tournament. There were guys, many people there around Eufaula getting in there, and they know where those holes are and where you're going to find those big flatheads or blue cats.
And they were kind of ahead of the curve, now that I think about it, with filming that kind of stuff, because we've had a whole bunch of increase in film shot in Oklahoma alone.
Yes. So that Okie Noodlin was Brad Beasley. And
relative of yours?
No, different spelling. So distant relatives. He also did the one on a great documentary, The Creek Runs Red, about Tar Creek and Pitcher and Carden up in northeast Oklahoma. But yeah, you're right. He was, when we think about, all the filming that takes place around here now, yeah, he was here pretty early.
Yeah, we had Scorsese film one day here at the Federal Building, which I got to learn a lot more about. Very interesting building over there on 3rd.
It's on Cheyenne, yep.
Cheyenne. And built in 3 different phases. I definitely suggest going to check out that post. But Scorsese was here. We had some heavy hitter actors, and we became Tulsa became a heavy hitter. Sterling Harjo with the success with FX and native representation for Res Dogs. And,
yes, big fan of Sterling. We were talking about Gilchrist. Another memory I have of Gilchrist, that was the first time that I met Sterling, was at Gilchrist when he was in town with the 1491.
Yeah, he mentions that in the podcast, and he mentions Tulsa as well, so he's still a Tulsa guy, and I got a chance to hang out with their crew at one of the rap parties. So, easily approachable, and
yes.
Other film-related items, not new, but old. We have the plaques that were put up, an Outsiders plaque outside of Circle, the Hall of Fame, or the Walk of Fame on the ground there, and a second Rumblefish plaque at 3rd Street across from the existing one. And, those have been obviously in the news a lot, and obviously great plaques as well, just commemorating the shooting locations, which is a great idea.
I appreciate Danny O'Connor, Danny Boy, and all that he has brought, and that's his project, that's his passion project, and here in Tulsa we are fortunate to have him here.
He said this. We were filming the other night with Thomas C. Howell, getting this virtual tour. Both Thomas C. Howell and Darren Dalton, who are the kind of the main Soch and the main actor, we had them both record introduction for our virtual tour. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, we had a 360 camera and we went inside the house. You were there, in fact, for some of the shooting of that, I believe.
Yep.
But we did a whole, online virtual tour, which exists on online, and we do those tours for students all over the country, because that book is a recommended reading for all 7th grade or somewhere around that age group. But we do Zoom recordings with, as far as Massachusetts was one that I did recently, and we have another one coming up. That's been very fun, and the fact that we keep improving it, I'm going to be interested to see where it is later this year. What other things come to mind from last year? You spent a lot of time at the Spotlight. We were there for 4th of July.
I did. It's kind of weird how that all worked out for me. So the Spotlight Theater is like a block, maybe 2, from where I live there in Riverview. And I had been a number of times. I think the first time I was there to see The Drunkard was back probably early 90s. But when, so excited when they were reopening the theater. So me and my oldest granddaughter Went for reopening night, which was May 1st or so, somewhere around there. And then went a couple weeks later with some of the neighbors. One of the neighbors' daughters wanted to try out for one of the roles. And so I went kind of as emotional support, and we were talking, and one of the people that was conducting these tryouts was like, you with the voice. Hey, yeah. So, they kind of suckered me into being the MC. So, couple times a month, maybe on a Saturday night, that you will find me there at the historic Riverside Studio in the Spotlight Theater, being the host and MC for the Drunkard and Olio. And then they invited me to be on their board of directors. So now I'm on the board of directors. You and I were there for their open house July 4th.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it all started 4th of July when we kind of just walked in, right? I mean, didn't they have some kind of...
Well, they did, I think they announced it in our neighborhood association that they would have an open house that day. And since, of course, the fireworks were back and they're right on the river, what better place, to hang out.
And it doesn't get dark until like 10 in the summer.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, they gave us a tour into how it was built into the hill, and then
that's right.
And then I did a subsequent post.
That was the first time that I was, upstairs and back behind.
Oh yeah,
and I have a full tour of that building again on my YouTube channel.
Yep. And that hat that you're wearing too is a good one. So it's easy to stick out when you see
the
it.
flat hat. It's an Amish hat. That's what I wear on stage.
That's a good one.
So I've got the suspenders, all that thing. That's part of my 1840s. I think was when the Drunkard was supposed to take place. It's a fantastic, hilarious, melodramatic temperance play. You should see it if you haven't. If you're listening and you are in Tulsa, in the Tulsa area, or going to visit Tulsa, it's a Saturday night that you won't forget, I assure you.
And over in that neighborhood, that's a happy moment, but one of the kind of not as happy moments from this past year was the tree that was over and you did a post on that on your YouTube as well, the eulogy for the tree.
I did, yep. It was, I called it the arch. My kids called it the rainbow tree because, it was this cottonwood that had grown, it was a younger cottonwood. So to avoid the competition of some of those older cottonwoods, it grew out over the trail and then kept leaning until it formed this perfect arch over Riverside, the River Parks Trail. But of course, could not stand. And she eventually succumbed to gravity last year, and is gone.
Goes into the archives.
There you go.
Because imagine how many people, and I'm sure there's a number, but the people that use Riverside and just for the really recreation in Tulsa in general, but have passed underneath that tree or by it, and then we mention it, and then they can kind of remember that. But speaking of researching and remembering stuff, the library research facilities, the Oklahoma room, which maybe not a lot of you guys have been to, but up on the third floor, there's a great research facility, and it was closed for a short amount of time.
Yeah, most
long
of 2020.
Long yeah. And so it was tough to get in there, and certain things aren't online, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things exist in there, and so you have to actually go up there, and it's great to be back up there.
So those Sanborn maps where we can look back at the maps, dating back to the 1890s. The Polk directories, I think, are the resource that I use the most, but all the vertical files that are in there, all of the microfilm from the Tulsa World, Tulsa Tribune, other Tulsa newspapers, all of that is up on the third floor. So I missed that place and glad that they opened last year finally.
And up about on the third floor, something that didn't run, the Skyride, which is right above the ground at the fairgrounds, and that goes back to 1965. And of course, you remember riding it.
I remember
the
it
fact
well.
that
State Fair at Bell's, Ride the Zingo.
Bell's.
Yeah.
It was
Fairgrounds
unfortunately
was very different.
ungoat-tastic. But there's, and for those of you that don't know, goat-tastic was a thing that the State Fair had back in 2015, a promotional thing. But
Right, with their mascot, the goat.
yeah, the goat.
The fair,
And,
it's goat-tastic.
He is a great mascot.
Greatest of all time.
Yeah.
Right? The
Well,
goat.
it's one of Tulsa's greatest mascots of all time. But there's a petition.
Second to Noodlers, right?
Well, yeah, I guess we forgot to mention that. But the petition online, to help the Skyride maybe get back up and running, is there. And it's maybe one of 13 left in the country, and nearly one of
Is that right?
2
Wow.
or 3 of the oldest.
Sure.
And it was used in New York, pretty much the same kind of design, 64, 65 for
that was the World's Fair. Okay.
And so just looking back at this past year, that's kind of a recap. And of course, like I said, we didn't mention everything, but
It was a very eventful year.
so what do you think that we missed from this past year, or what we forgot to mention? Leave it in the comments below. And if you like this podcast, give us a follow and be sure to like this episode. But that will do it for this edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Nicholas.
And I'm John Beasley.
And if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas, reach out directly, social media at TulsaPast, TulsaPast at Gmail, and TulsaPast.com. We plan to be on more podcast platforms soon, so just be on the lookout for that. I want to thank Jimmy, our audio engineer, the Patreon supporters, and everyone who has encouraged this venture so far. So that'll do it. Thanks for listening to this episode of Tulsa Times.